Hi everyone, welcome back to What They Don't Say. It's Shannon and we need to chat. It's been a while. I acknowledge that. I'm not oblivious to the fact that it has probably been maybe 2 months since I've uploaded. I'm honestly not sure how long. I just know it has been a long time. A lot has been happening behind the scenes. So one of my friends always talks about how you're constantly juggling things in life. You have glass balls and you have plastic balls that you are juggling. Glass balls are things where like you absolutely cannot drop them. Plastic balls are things that you would prefer to not drop, but if they do drop, it's not the end of the world. And typically the podcast is a glass ball for me. And in the past few months, it has become a plastic one. There has just been some things that have taken precedent over this, and it makes me so sad because the start of What They Don't Say, like everything started with the podcast. And so I do not want to let it slip away into nothingness. Having these conversations is so important to me. So I just want to apologize to you guys and thank you for your patience. On top of all of this, with sort of dropping this podcast ball, working in this space can be really emotionally draining. And I think in previous years and in previous times, I could work hours and hours and hours and hours a day and have no problem. And I think more recently, the emotional side of being in this space has begun to take a little bit of a toll. And I seem to hit a limit where I just cannot do anymore. And so that's another reason why I just haven't really been around as much. As just I've been hitting my limit a lot easier lately. And it has prevented me from being able to do all the things I want to do, including record weekly. So with all that being said, you and I are far overdue for a conversation that I actually recorded an episode of a couple months ago, and then I decided not to upload it. And this conversation was one that I have been wanting to have for a really long time. And this conversation is talking about the fact that my rapist is in prison, or was. We're going to get to that later. But when this podcast started, I had an idea in my head of what I wanted it to look like. And part of that vision was doing things chronologically, as well as bringing guests on to talk about things outside of personal experiences. I'm very aware that we have not talked about cross-examination. We've not talked about testifying in court. We have not talked about impact statements. And there's all these other things that I really want to talk about. And so I kept putting off the fact that my perpetrator was convicted and was spending time in prison. I kept putting that off into the distance, thinking like, well, there's all these other episodes that need to be recorded before we get to that. And now I realize that I just simply need to just do. Sometimes you can't have everything be perfect. I'm sure for a lot of you guys, perfectionism is the enemy of good and just like getting stuff done. And I definitely experienced that in my personal life a lot. Today's episode is long overdue, and we are going to be talking about my perpetrator being sentenced to prison, and now that he is out of prison. And on that note, let's get into the episode. I want to give you guys a sort of overview of just what it generally felt like to get a guilty verdict. I'm just going to kind of word vomit because there's no real other way to do it besides that. You know, a huge reason of starting this podcast is just being able to share these experiences that I wish I had known about prior to going into them. So that's what I'm going to do. So when did all of this take place? When did this happen? Back in December of 2021, we had a week-long court-martial. When I say court-martial, that is just the military term for a trial. I went through the military court process because my perpetrator was attending the Air Force Academy at the time, and originally a couple of the victims were also attending the academy. And so that's why we went through the military court system. And so yes, court-martial is the same thing as a trial. It's just the military term for it. Trial took place essentially like the week or so before Christmas, and it was 1 week long. At the end of the trial, my perpetrator did end up being convicted, not on all charges, but on several of them, and he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Now, the 6-year sentence was not 6 years just for my charges. It was 6 years in total. So everything he was found guilty on, he was given 6 years in total for those charges. He was not found guilty on all charges. He was found guilty on a few of them, but not all of them. Even though he will be discharged from the military when being released from prison, he was sentenced to spending time in a military prison. And so at the end of this very exhausting process, it was about 2 years leading up to trial, a very emotionally exhausting time, he was sentenced to 6 years. And on one end of the spectrum, that was the whole reason all the victims, including myself, were there, was to hopefully end up with some sort of sentence where he would be serving prison time. That to me was the very thing that I spent so long thinking about, putting him behind bars. And I think a lot of people go into trial thinking, I want to win. I want to win this case and put him behind bars. And in a lot of ways, that was how I thought about it. It was like, oh, we're going to win if he's put behind bars. And what I realized through going through this process is that I don't really know if there was any quote unquote winning. It's very hard to feel a win when the process itself is so dehumanizing. And that's not to say that I'm not grateful for the result of him being found guilty and being sentenced to prison time, but it is to say that this process was probably quite literally one of the hardest things that I've ever done in my life, if not the hardest thing. And so by the end of it, you're so exhausted and so much has been sort of taken from you throughout the process that it doesn't feel like a win. I was still harmed. Other women were still harmed. My perpetrator is somebody's son who caused that harm and who's going to spend time behind bars. And I'm not saying this to discourage you guys from going through the process. I'm saying it because I think what I've seen is a lot of sort of, two ends of the spectrum. Like on one end of the spectrum, I've seen people who have gotten justice who are like so excited and they're like, fuck that guy, like he should go away forever. And they're totally allowed to feel that way. But on the other end of the spectrum, I've basically seen like nobody talk about it. And so I just want you to know that, yes, I was grateful that he was found guilty, but there's a big part of it that doesn't necessarily feel like a win in a lot of ways. And in others, it does, because at the end of the day, we wanted him to be put behind bars and he was. I had spent so much time in those 2 years wondering what it would feel like for him to be put in handcuffs. It was an odd feeling to know that the very first night that he would be sleeping in jail would be the first night that I was no longer having to deal with this process. And he was quite literally put in handcuffs and taken away on the spot. Once he was convicted and sentenced, which that took a full other day, they put him in handcuffs and they took him right to jail, like in front of his family. He had brothers there. The victims were all there. We saw him be put in handcuffs and taken away. Going home that night was so bizarre because I had spent so much time obsessing and thinking and wondering about like this exact moment and what it would feel like for him to be convicted and found guilty, and just even obsessing over the process itself, like what's happening behind the scenes in trial. Is my case moving forward? What do they think about this? Are there other women out there? And then for him to for all of a sudden it to be over, I just get in my car and I just drive home after. What do I do? Do I eat a snack? Do I drink a margarita? Do I celebrate? Do I be happy? Do I be sad? And I think I felt almost all of those things. So the day after trial, I definitely felt a big sort of emotional hangover. Things were just, I was dissociating. I just did not feel like I was there. I felt very much like a zombie. And what was kind of sad, but also could have been a good thing, was Christmas was the following week. And so we left just a few days after trial to go to the mountains to spend Christmas there. And I just remember looking out the window and feeling like, this is not real. My perpetrator is in prison. I am not a real person. This didn't just happen. I can't believe this is over. What happens now? Who am I now that this trial is over? Does this mean my assault? Does this mean I'm done processing it because trial is over? And these were just sort of the questions that were reeling through my head, along with feeling very numb and very dissociated. I was having all of those questions. I really remember in sort of the first couple of weeks after trial, feeling like nothing, like I just didn't want anything. Like I didn't want to be with my family, but I didn't want to be alone. I didn't really want to eat, but I didn't want to be hungry. I just simply didn't know what I wanted, and it all just felt bad. Like everything just kind of felt not good. That feeling did wear off, and I just want you to know that. But I just want you to know that if you're in the thick of that, I think it's okay that things are neither here nor there. I remember I lashed out a lot at my parents, and I felt like everything they did bothered me. I felt exceptionally irritable. I felt like I wanted to talk about it, but I didn't know how to talk about it. And it just, yeah, I think with hindsight, that was a time in my life where I was just in the thick of hurt and pain, and while simultaneously being really numb and dissociating. And so be patient with yourself. If you lash out at people, it's okay to apologize and tell them what's going on, but give yourself some grace, because that's like a really big thing to be experiencing and going through. And if you don't give yourself grace, then you're just going to keep beating yourself up when you're already down in the dumps, and that's not going to be productive. In hindsight, I wish I had planned a sort of week after trial just strictly for rejuvenation, getting support, therapy. A therapy session would have been great. Just really preparing for this new void that had been created. And that void for me really was the obsession with trial. I'm not necessarily proud to say it, but I was very much obsessed with the process of leading up to trial, and obsessed in a sense that sexual assault takes so much space in your brain and your body, and thinking about the harm that happened was so consuming for me. And then trial was something that felt more tangible for me to sort of latch onto, such as, reaching out to my attorneys, figuring out where we were in the situation. Did we have a date picked out for trial? What else needs to be prepared before going to trial? Like, all of those things were tangible ways for me to grasp on to my experience in a way that felt like I had control. And so then there was this kind of weird void that took place after trial. So I was emotionally hungover. I had all these thoughts of, well, what now? Then also that's when you begin to process the trial itself and all of the re-traumatization that comes with it. As you can imagine, trial is emotionally draining on a whole new level that I never expected. You are having to relive everything that happened to you in grave detail. No stone is left unturned. And then on top of that, you're doing it in a room, typically with strangers, depending on the situation, in front of, a male jury, in front of perhaps male attorneys, in front of your perpetrator. I was in the same room as him. Then your story is questioned on multiple levels. It is painful. So all I'm saying is that if you have any sort of legal proceeding in relation to your sexual assault, if you can afterwards, make sure you have time carved out to take a couple days. If you can take some time off of work, take some time off of school, send professors an email or anything like that, have a support system in place, and be like you don't know how you're going to feel after these experiences. You cannot anticipate what it's going to be like. And so anticipate that it's going to be hard. And if it ends up being less hard, great. At least you have those guardrails in place. I just really wish that I had sort of prepped for that. And I was grateful that I was going on my Christmas vacation, but it wasn't with a purpose of, I'm going to need to support and help and to process during this time. And so it kind of resulted in me just being dissociated, numb, and taking a lot of naps, which there's nothing wrong with that. But I would have done things differently if I could go back. The verdict itself, I want to talk about the 6-year concept. I really wasn't sure if he was going to be found guilty. I think everything that I had read and understood about this process was that it is very rare to have a conviction that results in prison time for sexual assault. In fact, that percentage is 2.5%. 2.5% of sexual assaults that are reported in the United States will result in a conviction that has jail time. 2.5%, which is very, very low. To give you another perspective, for every 1,000 perpetrators, 975 of them will walk free. So convictions are very rare in the case of sexual assault. I don't know if it's different for military sexual assault, if they have a higher conviction rate. I really don't know. To give even more background, with all of the charges that were on the table, the maximum amount of time that he could have received was 45 and a half years. It might have been 46 and a half years. I can't remember. But it was a lot of years. That was the maximum amount of time. And prosecution was asking for 10 years. And so 6 years was sort of something in between there. And my first thought was, okay, that's a pretty decent amount of time. 6 years, is that kind of a lot? I'm not sure. And the prosecutors were able to give some context and say that that was one of the longest sentences that they had seen for a case like this in a very long time. And so the signal that was sent to me was, oh, well, 6 years is kind of a lot, so I should feel really good about this. And I did for a little while. And I started to realize is that 6 years in prison is better than nothing, but 6 years is no comparison to the life sentence that survivors of sexual assault have to endure. Sexual assault is not something that leaves. Now, everybody is different in the way that they heal. Some people move on from it very quickly, but on some level, for everybody, sexual assault is always there. Survivors do not get time off for good behavior. We don't get to clock out from being assaulted. It is very much a part of us forever in some way, shape, or form. And so 6 years, yeah, better than nothing. But on the other hand, it felt like, well, he gets 6 years, but I have a lifetime of trying to heal from this. It doesn't quite feel even, you know what I mean? With the 6 years, I've gotten a couple questions of, do you feel guilty that he is in prison? And for starters, I just want to thank the people who asked me that. These are the kinds of questions that I really like to receive because they feel very honest. And a lot of the times I've probably already thought about them. At first, I think I did feel a little bit uneasy about the fact that he was in prison. Like, I felt like I had this secret, and sometimes I still feel this way of, oh my gosh, like when I'm in a room with new people, nobody knows that I've been in a trial, had charges against somebody, and now that person is in prison. Nobody in this room knows that. Sort of like I have this little secret that I'm harboring. And then I perpetually have to remind myself that I did not put my perpetrator in prison. He put himself in prison by harming other people. I did pursue justice against him, but I did not put him there. He put himself there. And that is a very distinct difference in this scenario that I think is very important for people who have gotten justice and been through this process, that all of this they did to themselves. In our society, we have laws in place. Sexually assaulting another human being is a crime. And there are punishments for that crime. Now, they're not always, and very often, they're not carried out. But I think we forget in all of this that assaulting another human being is illegal. There are punishments written down for this crime. And so I think that that's a helpful reminder. And so do I feel guilty that he is in prison? Not really. I'm definitely somebody who humanizes my particular perpetrator a lot, knowing like I know his mother, I know his father, not well, but I know what they look like. I know what they sound like. I've been in rooms with them. I've had dinners with them, and it's been a long time. You know, I know he has brothers. And so like thinking about, okay, well, he's missed how many Mother's Days or birthdays or holidays while in prison. But at the same time, that is the punishment for the crime. A jury sat in a room and decided that he needed some time away from the real world to think about what he did and to face it. And so do I feel guilty that he is in prison? Not particularly, because I did not put him there. He put himself there. My perpetrator was sentenced to 6 years in prison in December of 2021, which meant 6 years from then would be December of 2027. And when he received this sentence, from my understanding, as well as the other victims who I've talked to about this, all of us were given the impression that he was not going to be released early, that the nature of his sentence, the fact that this was a military a cadet at the time, the fact that he had sexual abuse of a child charges, he was not going to be released early. He was going to serve the 6 years. That's what the impression that we were given from trial counsel. So for the past 4.5 years, maybe you're wondering, what has it been like for me on this side of things with him being behind bars? What is it like when you have this experience? And for the most part, I would go about my day, I'd be doing my thing, and then I would randomly think, oh, it's kind of weird that I'm in my kitchen cooking potatoes right now, and he's just in prison. And then I would think, well, what is he doing in prison? Is he working out? Does he have to go to treatment? Does he have friends? Is he getting assaulted in prison? How many phone calls does he get a day? Does he get to make money? I found myself Googling the prison that he was in and trying to figure out information about it. And I couldn't figure out anything, which made me just Google more things to try to figure it out. And I've spent a lot of time wondering, what will prison do for my assailant? Because I've never been to prison. I don't know anyone who's been to prison. And part of me thinks and wonders, you know, is this prison time going to be worth it when he gets out? Is he going to go have some sort of treatment and come out on the other side knowing that he's caused harm, acknowledging that he caused harm, and having the tools to not do it again? Or is he in there every day resenting the women who brought these charges upon him, believing, like thinking that it's just we all lied or something, and that, you know, like, I don't know what he thinks. I don't know what this time in prison can do to somebody. On one end of the spectrum, I'm kind of uncomfortable with how much I have thought about my perpetrator and his time in prison. But on the other end of the spectrum, I think it makes a lot of sense. And this is an odd thing. This whole experience is really fucking weird when you really take a step back and you're like, oh, this guy who used to be kind of a part of my family and was super close with all of us, then all of a sudden he sexually assaulted me and then 2 other people that I love and care about. And then, you know, we like go through this investigation, and then I like, you know, had to tell my whole story, and then someone decides that, oh, okay, he must have done that, and then he's put in prison, and now I'm just like living in the world and he's like in some metal box somewhere with a whole bunch of other sex offenders. Like, that's weird. That's really weird when you think about it. This is not a normal experience. And so, yeah, I've thought about it a lot. And I guess that's the whole point of this. Another reason that I have not fully talked about the fact that my perpetrator is in prison is because on the few occasions where I have briefly, lightly, so smallly mentioned it, I have received messages or comments that say things like, well, you are lucky that your perpetrator is in prison, or you are lucky that you got your day in court. I didn't get my day in court. And my first thought is, yes, I understand that I got to have my day in court and that my perpetrator was convicted, and that is very rare, and that I am fortunate to have had both of those experiences. And it breaks my fucking heart to know that that is a rare experience in this space. My next thing is that I do believe that you have the right to be really angry about that, or really upset and sad and frustrated about the fact that you didn't have a day in court and your person wasn't found guilty, or maybe he was found guilty, but not in the capacity that felt worth it. And you have every right to be mad, frustrated, upset, to have breakdowns about it, and to be upset that someone else has it and you didn't. You have every right to be mad, angry, upset, frustrated with the fact that you didn't get what you needed and you're still there, the one who was harmed. And I acknowledge that, and I hear you and I see you. But if anything, I believe that that anger and frustration and sadness should be put at the perpetrator and the systems that we have that are so broken right now. As I've kind of already discussed, someone getting sentenced to prison does not undo the harm that was caused. Him getting put in handcuffs doesn't all of a sudden take away the harm that he caused me. I will serve a life sentence for the sexual assault in some capacity, trying to heal and become whole again. Prison time is simply a punishment for the damage that was done, but it does not undo the damage that was already caused. And I need to note with this that comparing suffering does not reduce anybody's pain, and saying things like, well, at least yours went to prison, implies that somebody's pain is only valid relative to somebody who has had it worse. Experiencing pain and harm, especially in this space, it is not a competition. And somebody else's lack of getting justice does not diminish your right to grieve your experience and what happened to you, or vice versa. Somebody getting justice also doesn't diminish your right to grieve this experience that has happened to you. And this whole thing, like the entire concept of fighting so hard to get justice and going through that process, and then somebody who has experienced harm in the same way that you have, it, like, guys, aren't we all on the same level here? Like, don't we all want justice? Don't we all want sexual harm to not happen? Don't we want to put people behind bars, or for justice to take place in whatever that looks like for you? Aren't we all on the same team here? Like, just wanted to point that out. An analogy for this idea of comparing your pain to somebody else's is that, imagine if you broke your arm and then somebody came up to you and said, well, there are other people who have broken both of their arms, so you really shouldn't complain. Your arm is still broken. You're still not able to use that guy for several weeks, if not months. Their situation, like somebody else, having both arms broken does not heal your broken arm. Other people having it harder doesn't mean that your pain isn't real or that it doesn't matter. Your pain exists on its own terms, not in comparison to other people's pain. A few more final things about this idea of somebody being lucky for getting to have their day in court. And I want to reiterate, like, you are allowed to be mad that you don't get a day in court or that that lawsuit didn't go through. Whatever that looks like, you are allowed to be mad that you did not get justice. And that is very valid. And I really want to make sure that you guys understand that. I'm not saying that people are not allowed to be upset for not getting justice. But when it comes to targeting this anger at survivors who did get justice in some capacity, I need to remind you that you should be directing that anger at the perpetrators who caused the harm, at the system that is so broken, and at all of the people who enabled this behavior in the first place, whether it be institutions who do not push hard enough to talk about sexual assault, whether it be people's parents who allow shitty behavior from their sons or their daughters, and who tell their daughters to laugh when they're uncomfortable, or who tell their sons that if don't take no for an answer, pony up. Be mad at all of those enablers and the perpetrators and the systems that are so broken. Do not be mad at a fellow survivor and victim who's experienced a similar harm that you have. I say similar because we can all relate to some capacity of sexual assault, but everybody's experience is a little bit unique. But be mad at those people, not the person who has also been harmed. Also, when a perpetrator is quote unquote held accountable through the justice system, let that be a small sense of hope. Let it fuel the fire to believe that there is a brighter future out there where the system is not broken the way it is now. Let it be a potential glimmer that more justice can potentially take place in the future that can be beneficial for other victims and survivors. And I don't know if this next thought is particularly a true thought, but in my head, I think, okay, for those who want to speak out and want to press charges and want to get convictions, the more that happens, I believe that the more people will actually end up getting justice in the long run. I'm not saying that it's fully on us to do all of that and to always press charges and then we should always push survivors to do that. I'm just saying that the more people that do it, I believe will eventually turn into more people getting justice. And that could be a completely wrong out there thought, but it's just sort of how I think about this. This idea of sort of punishing survivors for quote unquote succeeding in this justice system that we really want to work. We want this justice system to work, but punishing them for that, it doesn't make any sense because it completely undermines the collective goal that we all have, which is to get survivors the justice that they deserve. I understand why people have made comments like that, but also sort of pointing back to my original point in all this is this whole thing, this is about justice. And justice in a big sense is taking a scale and trying to make it equal, knowing that you will never, ever be able to equalize punishment for the harm that was caused, at least in my personal, humble opinion. Ray Epstein, who I'm sure you guys have seen her on social media. She's one of my good friends and she works in this space. And she talks a lot about feeling whole again. And I think I went into trial thinking that if my perpetrator is put behind bars, then I will be fixed and all of the harm will go away and everything will be good. And it will be as if I wasn't even sexually assaulted. Like everything will be like, done, close that chapter, all things are good, hallelujah. I learned that's not the case. When my perpetrator, when I saw him be put in handcuffs, I realized that there was still very much a lot of harm that was living in my body. And so since that day, a lot of my experience has been trying to put my pieces back together to feel whole again. It's not about going back to who I was pre-sexual assault right now. And since that day he was convicted, it has been all about finding ways to be a new whole person. I imagine that a lot of victims go into this justice process assuming that it will fix you. And that's not to say that there won't be incredibly empowering moments. I can tell you wholeheartedly that standing in the room with my perpetrator, reading my impact statement, forcing him to listen when he did not listen to me the night of my assault was empowering. I can tell you that pointing at my perpetrator when the attorney asked, is your assailant in the room? And I said, yes. And they said, point to him. And I pointed to him. That was empowering. I can also tell you that it did not fix me. So just know that if you are going through this process, that it is hard, it is dehumanizing, it is re-traumatizing, it can be empowering, it can be a way of sort of self-discovery and, unraveling your experience and trying to understand it more and answer the questions of why and what and how, because those are questions that have to be answered when you are sitting in a courtroom. But this whole experience cannot be one that is supposed to fix you and undo the harm, because it can't. And I perpetually like to say on this podcast that being a victim of sexual assault does not mean that you cannot live an incredible, beautiful, big, bold, bright life. You absolutely can. It is just understanding how to get to that point, because it is a new normal and it is a new finding a way to feel whole again. It is not about going back to who you were before. Let's take a quick break. At What They Don't Say, you know that we believe that consent is hot, and we believe it so much that we put it on a hoodie, we put it on a hat, and we're going to be putting it on other clothing items coming soon. Our merch says consent is hot, and on the sleeve of this hoodie it says you deserve to feel safe. So when you look down at your wrist, like in your watch area, basically, you will see you deserve to feel safe. It is embroidered. This hoodie is oversized. That's important to note. It is oversized. It is cozy. It is one of my go-to hoodies. So if you want your own oversized hoodie or baseball cap, or if you just want to support the podcast, go to whattheydon'tsay.com/shop to get yours now. Okay, back to the show. Okay, so 6 years. I thought that I had 6 years for him to spend in prison. And I was planning on sort of, next year, which would have been the year that he was supposed to get out, figuring out the whole release thing. When I say figuring it out, I mean figuring out, do I need to get a restraining order? Do I need some sort of protective order? Because when I think about my perpetrator, obviously sexual assault, rape, it is inherently a violent crime. I would say in my experience, yes, it was violent, but I wouldn't consider my perpetrator to be a person who I would expect to break into my home or, slash my tires. But I also don't know, what has this time in prison done to someone? Have they spent it planning their revenge? Are they scared of me? I don't know. And so I had sort of the idea of, okay, 2027 will be the year that I figure out my quote unquote safety plan when my perpetrator is going to be getting out of prison. Surprise, my perpetrator is out of prison. And you're thinking, Shannon, it can't be right, because the day is Wednesday, May 13th, 2026, and he's not supposed to get out until December of 2027. That just doesn't add up. Like 2026 is not the same as 2027 in the 6 years, and him not getting released. And so how did that happen? How did we get here? How was he sentenced to 6 years and then all of a sudden he's out of prison? Well, now we are getting into the second half of the episode, which sort of has to do with where the hell I've been for the past 2 months and what's been going on and why I managed to drop this ball of the podcast and everything that's been going on. Like, listen when I say I will be interviewing people. I have an interview scheduled for next week. I'm going to get back into the normal swing of things. I just simply could not proceed with recording podcast episodes until we talked about all of this prison stuff. And so that's why we're fucking here. Talking about my perpetrator getting released from prison early and me not being notified. I'm going to give you guys the full spiel rundown of how my perpetrator is released, what I know about the situation, and every step along the way that I have gone through to get to the point of where I am right now today. There's a lot of stuff, and typically I wouldn't go into the weeds this deep, but I think it's important to see this process and to understand that when you are going through these legal processes, there are so many points in them where typically, unless I think you have a law background or some sort of background in this space, you don't know what the fuck is going on. You don't know what all this, these legal terms mean. You don't know what the standard practices are. You are probably just kind of doing what is told by an advocate or by your attorney if you are lucky enough to have one of those. And so the things that you are told are typically, you probably just sort of take them at face value. Okay, well, if you're told that X, Y, and Z can't happen, or that you're not allowed to know something, then you just kind of assume, okay, well, I guess I'm not allowed to know that, or I guess X, Y, and Z are supposed to happen. But what I have learned over the past month is there are a lot of things, and I learned this too throughout the trial process, because I was the squeakiest of wheels. Let me tell you guys, I was a squeaky freaking wheel. I was calling, I was annoying. When trial counsel, my attorney, when he saw my name pop up on his phone via text or phone call, he knew, oh shit, here we go again. I'm going to have to figure some stuff out because Shannon is a darn squeaky wheel. And where was I going with this? Oh yes. So I have learned in the past month that all of these things, not all of them, but there are many things where you just are forced to take them at face value because as a victim, you don't know what the hell is going on, and you are putting your trust in people that you don't know who are supposed to protect you, such as attorneys, such as the system. And they tell you this is just the way it is. This is just the way things operate. And I'm learning that that is not always true. Things do not always operate the way that they are supposed to. And most of the time, they don't operate the way they're supposed to at all. Or the way that they operate sucks and needs to be changed. I'm going to give you the full rundown. It's going to be a little confusing. I'm going to need you to stick with me. On April 7th, 2026, my mother received an email that said, "Hi, ma'am, please see attached." This email was somebody from the prison that my perpetrator was being held at the time, and the attachment was essentially a form, a document that looked like a W-2. It was just a form that said the perpetrator's name and that he was going to be released on May 10th, 2026. It did not say, there was no box that was checked about parole, no box that was checked saying mandatory supervised release, just basically a form that looks like a W-2. If I can, I will put a picture of it here. I will redact his name and everything for privacy reasons. Not privacy for him, privacy for myself, just to clarify. And that was how my mother found out that he was going to be released. Now, that's April 7th. April 8th, my mother and my stepdad call me to tell me that they have received this email and that my perpetrator is going to be released on May 10th, 2026. When I got this phone call, there was a lot of confusion, a lot of, what do you mean he's being released? He's supposed to be there for another year and a half. He's only served 4.5 years. He's got another year and a half left. This is only 75% of his sentence. And I was 100% sexually assaulted. So you're telling me that he only needs to serve 75% of his sentence, but I was still 100% sexually assaulted. What do you mean? That doesn't make any sense. So I check my email to see if I somehow missed one of these. I check my email. I check all 3 of my emails. I have received nothing from the prison, nothing from the Air Force, nothing from the Air Force Academy, no notification that he's being released. And so my immediate thought is, okay, well, if I don't know, who else doesn't know amongst all of this? Because something that you guys should know about this case, and depending on how long you've been around, you may already know this, there was originally 6 victims in this trial. It was me, 2 other people that I know, Lauren, who's been on the podcast before, she was one of them, one of my other friends. So 3, so me, my cousin, Lauren, and then one of my other friends were all victims of this man. And then through investigation, they found 3 other women that he had sexually assaulted. Now, all of those women were attending the Air Force Academy at the time. And by the time trial rolled around, they had all dropped their charges, but they were still asked to testify as witnesses to sort of demonstrate a pattern of behavior. I have absolutely no evidence of this, but I would imagine that they originally dropped their charges because historically the military has a nice reputation, if you will, for when people come forward about their sexual assault, they get punished in very obscure, weird ways, such as all of a sudden their grades are dropping if they're in college. People who are in charge of them start giving them all of these demerits. Like a lot of things start to happen where the message is sent without saying, hey, you should drop these charges. The message is sent pretty loud and clear that that's what needs to happen. And so once again, I have no evidence of that being the reason that these women ended up not pursuing charges against him. But it's just to say that originally there was 6 women. And in my mind, there is still 6 women, if not more, that have been assaulted by him. There just were only 3 that were on a charge list, which is still a lot of women, 3 more than it ever should have been. So when my mother tells me that he's going to get out, one of my first thoughts was, well, does anybody else know that he's going to get out? So I begin reaching out to other victims and asking if we can talk on the phone so that I can tell them this important information. While I'm waiting for their responses, I decide to reach out to the email that my mother received the email from. So this is the victim and witness coordinator at the prison that my perpetrator was being held at. And I say, hello, it has come to my attention that blank prisoner is being released. I was not notified, which is heavily concerning considering I'm a victim in this case. I begin to have communication back and forth with this victim witness coordinator at the prison regarding the fact that I was not notified. And now my purpose of emailing them was just to figure out, why didn't I get an email? And this person ends up asking me, ma'am, is your email correct? And the email that they are showing me is one that I do not initially recognize. And I'm like, no, that email is not correct. The email that is correct is the one I'm emailing you from. And then a light bulb goes off in my head, and I realize that that email is the email of my old victims counsel. So with going through the military court process, I was given a special victims counsel, an SVC. And essentially this person was kind of like an attorney, but they were essentially the middleman between prosecutors and me, the victim. So you have defense, which represents the accused or the perpetrator, and then you have prosecution, who is responsible for they're on the side, quote unquote, of the victim. And so my victim's counsel was the middleman between prosecution and me, the victim. And my victim's counsel, who I realized this email that they have on file as the contact information, that person has not legally represented me since 2022. So it's been quite a few years. And I'm like, wait a second, that's not right. So I decide to reach out to my old victims counsel to see if they received any notification. So I sent them a text. I said, hey, hope you're well. I understand that my, representation ended in 2022, but I learned that my perpetrator is getting out of prison next month, and no one notified me directly, but I've been told that communication regarding his prison status was possibly sent to you. Did you happen to receive anything? And the response that I get is from somebody completely different than my victim's counsel. And they're like, hey, yeah, hi, I'm somebody new. Your old victim's counsel, their phone has been given to me, and I don't know anything about this. Sorry. And I was like, oh, well, could you point me in a direction of somebody who might know? I end up getting on a call with this guy. In this scenario, these people are called Captain. So like, this isn't somebody's name, but let's say Captain Bob. That is their rank and their name. And so we're just going to call this person Captain Bob. So Captain Bob is the person that responded to me when I texted the phone number of my old victims counsel. Captain Bob ends up saying, you know what, let's get on a phone call. So I get on the phone call with Captain Bob, and he begins asking me questions, what's going on. I'm explaining the situation, explaining that my perpetrator is being released from prison and I was not notified about it. And he's like, ooh, yeah, that's not very good. Let's try to get to the bottom of this. He says that victims counsels are only in those roles for about 2 years. So obviously my perpetrator was sent to 6 years in prison. So if he was notified 6 years later, it was a high likelihood that my victim's counsel would no longer be in that role, because they're usually only in that role for 2 years. And he has not represented me since 2022. Captain Bob reaches out to my old victim's counsel, tracks him down to see if he has received any notification regarding this prisoner's status. Reaches out. Guess what? My old victim's counsel says, no, I did not receive any notification regarding so-and-so's prison status. So now I'm like, well, that's unfortunate, considering that I wasn't notified, and even the person who was allegedly notified was also not notified. Now, I began looking in depth at the form that my mother received, the one that sort of looked like a W-2, and in it there's a small box, and I'm going to read you what it says, because I think it's important that you understand that I looked at this form so many different times and did not understand what this truly meant. Which is just a whole other thing regarding that. None of this shit ever makes any sense. It's confusing for victims, but that's a whole separate issue. I need to zoom in on my laptop because the writing is so small. This is gonna be a lot of words, so buckle up. Note 1. Prior to the Service Clemency and Parole Board meeting, each facility will hold a disposition board to review the prisoner's clemency and parole submissions. Note 2. you may submit documentation to the facility disposition board where the prisoner is scheduled to appear. If you would like to submit a victim impact statement to the board, please mail it to the above address as soon as possible. Your statement may be submitted in the form of a letter or electronic media. This board reviews all victim impact statements in the original media in which they were submitted. Upon review of all the information available, the board adds its recommendation to the case file and the entire record, including the victim impact statement, which are forwarded to the Service Clemency and Parole Board. Note 3. Victim impact statements concerning U.S. Navy and Marine Corps personnel will be submitted to the U.S. Naval Clemency Parole Board. Note 4. The facility victim witness coordinator will notify you in advance of the approximate date of an upcoming Service Clemency and Parole Board hearing. So, in my redheaded brain, I read that and I think, wait a second, how I'm understanding this is that my perpetrator went before a clemency and parole board, and there was an opportunity for me as the victim to submit a victim impact statement to be in consideration regarding his release. Well, I was never notified about a clemency and parole board hearing. Therefore, I never submitted an impact statement to be heard at this hearing. Immediately, I'm like, ding, ding, ding. That's not good. Alarm bells going off. I feel like something is not right here. But this is one of those moments where I'm like, well, this is one of the things that I was talking about, how you don't know what you don't know. And I was thinking, well, maybe I'm just wrong. Like, I'm not sure. Now, while this is going on, I've heard back from the other people, other victims in the case, and I get on the phone with one of them and I say, hey, I'm really sorry to give you this news. So-and-so is being released from prison. They were not notified. This other victim who charges were found guilty on, she was not notified. And obviously my heart breaks because I never wanted to be the person to relay that information. I don't think it was fair or appropriate that that role was put on me, but I would so much rather be the one to tell them than have her or others not know at all. I also ended up talking with another victim from the case. They also were not notified. And so here you have 3 victims who were not notified. And that is concerning to me. That is very concerning to me, that to know that if it weren't for my mother being notified, none of us would have had any idea that he was about to get out of prison. That is crazy to me. That's crazy. But alas, onwards and upwards. I end up having a phone call with the victim witness coordinator at the prison. And I ask him, what information do you have on file for contacting me? The address that they have on file is an old address that I no longer live at. The phone number on file was my special victims counsel's phone number, and the email they had on file was my special victims counsel's email. So an old address and then a phone number and email that of somebody who has not legally represented me since 2022. This lovely victim witness coordinator at the prison tells me that victim counsels are not allowed to be put on the form that is given to the prison for prisoner status updates because it's typically an unreliable form of like people to notify because of things such as victim counsels only being in their role for 2 years. And so he was like, yeah, I don't know why your victim's counsel was listed as contact information on here. That's weird. It's supposed to be you. It is not supposed to be your victim's counsel. It needs to be you. So I'm like, well, then why the hell was my victim's counsel's name? Well, sorry, not name. Why were their phone number and email given to the prison? He also informs me that my perpetrator's release date has been moved up from May 10th to May 2nd because he has, quote unquote, earned days. These earned days are for good behavior. So he earned 8 days back. 8 days he had earned back very quickly, it seemed. He said that my perpetrator has no parole, but that he will need to check in with a sex offender officer every so often once he is released. I asked if there was anything that would stop my perpetrator from just driving across state lines because he is being released somewhere in Texas and I live in Colorado. And who am I? Like, is he just going to get in his car and come here and find me? Is there anything to stop him? And he said, yeah. He's not supposed to leave. He needs to ask for permission to go anywhere. But in theory, there's nothing stopping him from just driving here. He does need to go back to his area in Texas every so often to talk with his sex offender officer and check in and do all of that. But in theory, he could just get in his car and drive here. Would it be a good decision? Absolutely not. Could he do it? In theory, yes. I'm getting in the weeds. I told you guys I was going to give you a lot of detail, all the tea on this. I told him, this victim witness prison coordinator, that just so you know, none of the other victims were notified. And he said, well, hold on a second. And I can hear him clicking on his computer. And he says, there are no other victims in their prisoner database that need to be contacted or notified for prisoner updates. The only people listed in their database was me and my mother. No other victims, no other witnesses were listed, according to this person, in their prisoner database. That, again, alarm bells, because there were other victims in the case. So why are they not listed as people that need to be notified in the prison system, in the prison database? He tells me, and now this conversation with this person was really an effort for me to get information, to figure out how do I find where things went wrong. He tells me that victims and witnesses need to opt in to receive notifications. And remember, I know two of the other victims. I know that they are people who would have opted in to receive these notifications. And so I think it's very strange. He was kind of saying, well, maybe they just didn't opt in to receive these notifications, which seemed odd to me. So my next plan was to call the Air Force Academy Victim Witness Coordinator to see if their information that they had on file aligned with the information that the prison had on file. Now, I'm not an attorney, so remember this, but this is everything I figured out. There is something called a Form DD-2704 in the military, and it is a form that I later learned is filled out by trial counsel after trial, and it is the form that says, yes, this person, victim or witness, would like to opt in to receive notifications of the prisoner status meaning release, escape, death, those sorts of notifications. And so the form DD-270 form lists the victim witness, their name, whether they are a victim or witness, their email, their phone number, and whether they want to be opted in to receive these notifications. I was calling the Air Force Academy Victim Witness Coordinator to see if the information they had on file matched the prison information that they had on file. Now, I called them maybe 4 times throughout 4 different days, maybe 5 times, I can't remember. I left voicemails and I received nothing. Complete radio silence. I didn't leave voicemails every time, but I did leave them most of the time. So I let Captain Bob know. I let Captain Bob know everything I've been doing, everything I've been up to, who I've been talking to, what I've learned. And he told me that he was going to talk to his higher ups to see if there was anything that could be done regarding the situation, anything that could be resolved. And he said he would get back to me a couple days later. A couple days later, he gets back to me and he said that everything I had done regarding talking to the prison, trying to talk to the Air Force Academy, was exactly what his leadership recommended that I do. So in the several days that it took to get this information about what I should do, I had already figured out what to do as somebody who has no information. I was simply using Gemini, which is Google's, AI. And so, that was kind of like, oh, I understand they're trying to help, but really it took 3 days to get information from your leadership just to say the exact same thing I had already done. Any users. Then I decide, F all of this, I'm frustrated. I call one of my friends who is in law school. And I understand someone being in law school versus being an actual attorney, those are very different things. But, I'm a believer, use your resources, call the people in your network. You never know who's going to be able to help. So I call her and she begins digging into the UCMJ, which is basically the overarching stuff that the military has to follow. They are subject to. Okay. Everyone is subject to the UCMJ. And she finds something that says that victims are supposed to be notified 60 days prior to a prisoner's release. Obviously, I wasn't notified in the first place, but April 7th, when my mother received that email, to May 10th is not 60 days. I find this very interesting. I forward this to Captain Bob, or Bobby, whatever we're calling him at this point. Captain Bobby's like, ooh, yeah, I'll look into that. I'm not going to read the entire thing that was given to me by my friend in law school, but I will read the little blurb that it says. It says, upon written request, receive written notification from the appropriate official with custody not later than 60 days before the date of the intended destruction or disposal of the person. I find that interesting. What do you mean we're supposed to be notified within 60 days? I wasn't notified at all. A couple days after this, I end up having a phone call with the victim witness coordinator from the prison once again. It ends up being about a 40-minute long phone call, and I am just asking every question that I have in the book. And I want this to be a sort of example of advocating for yourself. It is so shitty that the majority of processes where you are looking for justice when it comes to sexual assault, you have to be the one advocating for yourself. And it is shitty because you most of the time have basically nothing left to give. And so I'm not saying that all 24/7 of the time was I always advocating for myself, always asking questions, always pushing to get answers. But there were a lot of times, and have been many times, where I did do that. And it's terrible. You shouldn't have to advocate for yourself, but do not be afraid to ask questions. Sometimes these people will make you think that you should be afraid to be curious and to want to know what's happening behind the curtain. Ask the question. Be loud. Because you just never know what sort of information you're going to get when you ask for it. And along with this, my initial tone towards the victim witness coordinator at the prison was pretty aggressive and upset and anger. Like, where did you F up? Like, how did this happen? And by the time I get around to this 40-minute phone call, which is on April 16th, I had tried to shift my tone a little bit. I was firm, but I wasn't trying to shit all over this person who I was talking to. And it actually ended up going a really long way. There was even multiple times in my phone call with this person where I said, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be aggressive. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. And he said multiple times, no, ma'am, you're actually one of the nice ones that I've talked to. Like, everybody is usually pretty upset when they're talking to me, rightfully so. And he even expressed that he was pretty unhappy with the system that is in place, and that the vibe I got was that he was basically doing his best to do what he could with this shitty system, but that there was a lot out of his hands because of the way that the system is set up. Now, I don't know how much of that is actually true. This is just what he was expressing to me. And so I just kind of want to make note that it is so fair to be so mad when talking to these people. And I have definitely been pretty off the hinges when talking to people in the past. But this sort of niceness I learned as I began to talk to him, that it actually really helped me. Even if I didn't have to be like a sweet cupcake who, wasn't acknowledging the gravity of the situation, but it ended up sort of working in my favor that I was a little bit on the nicer side and was sort of just trying to like come from a place of curiosity rather than just direct anger at this person. What I was trying to figure out on this call was just continuing to get information about why I didn't receive any notification from the prison. And this person said that typically they like to send emails if they have an email on file, because rather than sending like a letter to somebody notifying them of this, because letters, there are lots of different spots where points can get messed up. People move, those addresses change. But if they have an email on file, it's a stronger likelihood that the person will actually receive the notification. So essentially, even if they have an address on file, they prefer to send emails. So once they have an email on file, they usually send, at least this is what he was saying, they like to send notifications out that way. So I mentioned that I did not receive any notification regarding the parole board that my perpetrator went before, and therefore I was not able to submit an impact statement. Now, if you don't know what an impact statement is, you can be given the opportunity to give an impact statement in times where your perpetrator is convicted, but before sentencing, so figuring out like what the punishment will be. In this scenario, it would have been an impact statement given to the parole board that he was going before. He was requesting parole from what it sounds like, and this would have been given to the parole board to take into consideration regarding should he be released early on parole or not. And along with impact statements being used as an opportunity for a jury or a judge to understand where the victim has been harmed, it is also just a very important part of the process for the victim to be heard. So regardless of it being a thing that is informational for the person and people making these decisions, there are so many times in an assault experience and a justice experience where the victim is not, they are harmed, they are not heard fully. And so it is empowering, and it is such an important part to be able to express the harm that has been caused. Yeah, so an impact statement is a lot more beyond it just being considering as a factor in the decision, what happens with the accused. I expressed to this person that I was not notified about the parole board hearing, therefore I did not have the opportunity to give an impact statement. And he says, well, we sent a letter to your mother's address in November. And my parents are pretty anal. about checking the mail. And I was actually home when they said that they sent the letter, and there was no letter received. I asked my mom. My mother did not receive a letter. Like I said, they're quite anal about it. And I asked, well, did you have an email on file? And he said, yes. And I said, well, why did you send a letter instead of an email? And he said, I don't know. He didn't have an answer. Just, another ding, ding, ding. What's going on there? Why are we not sending an email? If you say that you send emails, if you have an email on file, but then you send a letter in a moment where you should have sent an email, that's a red flag to me. I inquired this person about this concept of being notified within 60 days of the person being released. And he says, well, it's actually 45 days, which to note, my mother was notified 33 days prior to his initial release date, May 10th, which ended up being moved to May 2nd. So he says, yeah, it's actually supposed to be 45 days notice for the person to be released, but with the way the system is in place. So his office, from what it sounds like, gets this sort of notification when the prisoner is working towards being released. Whatever the hell that means. I know that it includes things such as them needing to have an address that they're going to be released to, like a home, and somebody has to go to that home and approve the home. I don't think it can be very close to schools if they're registering as a sex offender. I think there are like certain things in place. And so his office gets a notification that ding, ding, this prisoner is working towards being released, but they are not allowed to send out notifications to the victims and witnesses until the perpetrator has all of their ducks in a row regarding their release. So he said that sometimes there are times where victims are not notified until the day of a perpetrator being released. That's insane. That is crazy. That should never happen. Essentially, what he's telling me is that, yeah, we're supposed to give 45 days notice, but the way that the system is set up, we cannot do so, because we cannot notify victims until the perpetrator has everything in order regarding their release. That's a flaw in the system, if you ask me. But alas. In addition to this, I just keep sort of asking questions about this notification system. And he tells me that only bona fide witnesses, whatever that means, will receive these notifications. But apparently my mother was considered a bona fide witness. So that's a piece of interesting information. In addition to that, he explains that if a prison sends 3 notifications out to somebody and they do not get a response of any kind, they get removed from the prison database. So essentially, let's say they sent 3 letters to the same address that was the wrong address for a victim, then that would mean that victim would be removed from the prison database and would have no opportunity to potentially receive any notifications regarding the status of their perpetrator. That is a major flaw in the system, because it seems that they frequently have wrong information on file, which was something that this person expressed to me. If you're not sending these notifications to the right place, then these victims and witnesses are just going to be removed from the database and have no chance of being notified of all this. Once again, that's crazy if you ask me. My next part of this conversation was an effort to understand why my perpetrator had these quote unquote earned days where he was supposed to be released May 10th, but then all of a sudden was released May 2nd. How does this happen? I had asked if he was in some sort of sex offender treatment, and this person was not allowed to tell me. I asked if they could tell me somebody who could tell me this information, because for me as a victim, it is important to know what has my perpetrator done while in prison. What about his time in prison is effective enough to release him a year and a half early before he was supposed to be released? Is he a new person? How have we decided this? How have we measured that it is okay for him to be released? What sort of treatment has taken place? And so I asked this person, was he in sex offender treatment? He said, I can't tell you. I said, well, can you point me in the direction of somebody who might be able to tell me? And he said, we aren't allowed to give that information. Then he basically alluded to the fact that, yes, he was in a sex offender treatment program. I can't tell you what that looked like, and I cannot tell you any other programs that he was in. And he also cannot point me in the direction of somebody who can tell me about that. So as a victim, it leaves you in the dark, because what sort of sense of comfort do I get from just, yeah, we decided to release him early because he earned these days for having good behavior? As a victim, I believe that we should have the right to know what sort of treatment perpetrators are getting in prison that allows them to earn days and be released early. I'm not saying that I need detailed notes from these sort of sessions with their therapist, although a part of me would really like to see those. I'm just saying that victims should get basic information regarding the treatment that their perpetrator is going through in prison. So this person expressed to me that prisoners have an opportunity to quote unquote earn days. These are earned days for good behavior that helps cut their sentence down. Since all of this, I have gone back into my trial files. For those of you who don't know, my trial files are these thick blue books that have it is the trial record. It is everything in relation to trial printed out into paper. And so I went back and I began looking for information related to these sort of earned days. And I'm going to read you guys this. An inmate begins serving confinement the day the sentence is announced. The inmate can receive credit in confinement from a variety of incentives. A, good conduct time. Unless the inmate received a life sentence, each inmate earns 5 days per month. So for good conduct and for being in prison, you earn 5 days a month off of your sentence. B, credit for participation. An inmate may earn up to 8 additional days per month for participating in work programs, rehabilitation programs, and educational programs. However, if an inmate does not participate in offense-specific treatment programs, they may only earn up to 5 additional days per month. So if an inmate is participating in their required treatment programs, they can earn up to 8 additional days a month. Also, it mentions work programs and educational programs. So if they are working towards getting a degree or maybe a work program, so maybe they're, doing electrical work, or I don't exactly know the jobs that they have in military prisons, but you can earn up to 8 additional days. So that is 13 days total per month that you can earn off of your sentence. C, extra good conduct time. Confinement facility commanders have the discretionary authority to grant additional credit for extraordinary acts. Extra good conduct time can be earned at the rate of 2 additional days per month for 12 months. So that is a total of 15 potential days that you can earn a month for good behavior in prison off of your sentence. You could essentially cut your sentence in half, right? A month, let's say, is about 30 days, 15 days, that's half a month, all for being a good dog in prison. I have an issue with the concept of sexual predators being able to earn days for good behavior in prison. My issue is this. We know from study after study, if you talk to therapists, psychologists, people who look at sexual predators, or people who have committed these sex crimes, we know that perpetrators are often very nice, they're charismatic, they're the people who make a community fall in love with them. They are the people who get people to trust them. They are people who come off as very good people. They're not often this outward portrayal of, hello, I'm a monster who's going to sexually assault you. That is not what perpetrators look like the majority of the time. This idea of being able to earn days, and also I'd like to note that gave no specifics regarding what good conduct actually is. So I'm assuming it's up to the discretion of the person in the prison, which I imagine varies a lot. But this idea that somebody can earn days for good behavior when that quote unquote good behavior is the exact thing that enabled somebody to sexually assault people in the first place, that feels backwards to me. That feels wrong. And, it's one of those things where it's like, well, yeah, of course my perpetrator didn't sexually assault a child in prison because there are no children in prison. And also he likes girls. So, there you have it. It's an odd concept to me to think that you could earn behavior for doing things like schoolwork and a job and your therapy when those things have nothing to do with the crime itself. Congratulations, he took the trash out. Congratulations, he made his bunk in the morning. What does that have to do with sexually assaulting somebody? What? Tell me where those things make sense. Tell me. So, as you can see, I get fired up about this, but I found that was interesting, that you could earn so many days. And this is military. I don't know if this is the same amongst all prisons. I'm just telling you that this was the information that was written in my trial record that I'm telling you about how many days can be earned. I end my phone call with this person from the prison with the statement of, I think it's weird that someone is only sent one form of communication, whether it be a letter or an email, but they never receive a phone call. And that it's clear that this person from the prison expressed that people don't typically get notified properly. It is a perpetual issue. And yet it is still the system that is in place. I talked to Captain Bobby, and I explained to him that I have been calling the Air Force Academy Victim Witness Coordinator to see if they have the same contact information on file as the prison does, and that I have gone to voicemail every single time. Well, he informs me, oh, that person is actually leaving the Air Force. So the contact information that was listed on the website is incorrect. He gives me a different contact. I end up calling them, talking to them. The information they have on file does match the prison. And this information is an old address. It is a phone number and an email from my old victims counsel. Remember how I mentioned this form DD 2704? This was the phone call where I learned that trial counsel fills out this form. This form is then given to the prison, and the prison puts all the information from this form into their prison database that then they use when somebody needs to be notified. They look up in their database who they need to notify, and they send out notifications based on what information is in their system. So I requested a copy of this form, and everybody else, all the other victims and witnesses who opted in to be notified, were redacted. So I could not see who these people were, but I was able to see that there was a column that said, would you like to be notified? Yes or no? And all of the redactions were in the yes column. And so there was 9 people in that column that requested to be notified. 9 of them. I am one of those people. My mother is one of them. So there were 7 other people besides my mother and I, from what this form is telling me, if it is given to the prison and put into a database, there should have been 7 people that should have been in the database for this prisoner. And remember that this person at the prison told me that they only had my mother and I on file. Where are the missing 7 that all opted in to be notified? Why aren't they in the database? I don't know. Captain Bobby, spoiler alert, never got back to me regarding the whole 60-day notification thing. I asked him for it 3 different times and he didn't. Granted, he does not have a legal obligation to me, but I just think it's important to know. While going through all this, I remember that my cousin on my dad's side, his wife was some sort of attorney related to sexual assault in the military for a while. And I end up getting in contact with her. I tell her all this information. And what I want is a chance to give an impact statement, and I want it to be considered regarding his early release, because I would prefer for him to not be released early. And so I end up talking with her, and she says, okay, I think you should write an impact statement, send it to the Clemency and Parole Board, and see if they would potentially consider it relating to his release. The world is so freaking small, because I tell her who the lead prosecutor is or was on our case, and she's like, oh my gosh, I actually work with him. She reaches out to him and asks if he can get involved in this case, or not involved in the case, but if he is willing to check into all of this and see what's going on. Now, while all of this is happening, I end up trying to find an attorney. I start going through a million different avenues, and one of my favorite podcasters, his name is Jordan Harbinger, and he talks about digging the well before you're thirsty. This is in the context of jobs. And so he talks a lot about the importance of your network and, having good connections with people before you are jobless and need to reach out to people for help. And so I was grateful that I have an awesome network in this space, and I reached out to people I knew, and I was like, hey, do you know any attorneys who can help me pro bono with what's going on? I don't even know what I need to do, but I need to figure out something. And I start going through a chain of attorneys. One person says they can take me on. I talk to them. They say, just kidding. No, we can't. I'll send you to someone else. And I start talking to all these people. And finally, I get connected with somebody. His name is Ryan. And 2 different people on the same day told me about Ryan. So I knew, okay, I've got to talk to Ryan. At this stage in the game, I have been told by my cousin's wife that it would be potentially a good idea to send an impact statement to the Clemency and Parole Board and just ask that it be considered. So I am then relaying this information to the other victims that I know, saying like, hey, you don't have to do this, but if you're interested in just trying something, this is something that you could try. Write an impact statement, send it to the Clemency and Parole Board, and ask that it be considered. So then I get in contact with Ryan. And Ryan and I have a phone call. He says, yes, I would love to represent you. And for legal reasons, I cannot give a whole lot of information about all of that. But essentially, we learn that my perpetrator was not granted parole. He was granted mandatory supervised release, which apparently is different than parole, but from what I understand, it's basically the same. And remember how My lead prosecutor somehow knew my cousin's wife. Well, he ends up sending me an email after asking a lot of people, is given the answer that, so the whole idea here is that my rights as a victim were violated. My right to be heard before Clemency and Parole Board by submitting an impact statement was violated. The fact that I was not notified, that is incorrect. There are laws in place that say I have the right to be notified, I have the right to be heard, and I was not notified and I was not heard. And through all this communication with my old lead prosecutor and who he talked to, he comes back with saying that I did not have the right to be heard because my perpetrator was not granted parole, because he was granted mandatory supervised release. There are emails where they say I do not have the right to be heard because he was not granted parole. But when you read the form, regardless of him not being granted parole, I still had the right to be heard. So from my POV, all of these people who are saying I don't have the right to be heard are covering their asses, because there are laws that say I have the right to be heard at the Clemency and Parole Board, heard through an impact statement. I was not given notification of that. So I'm not an attorney. This is all just me relaying information to you. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just saying that he went before a parole board. I wasn't notified. I didn't get to give an impact statement. Okay. Moving along. This issue of not being notified about these things is not a new issue in the military victim notification system. There are story after story where people are not notified. And my attorney tells me that he is a part of a couple organizations that help with the system related to military sexual assault. And they do work to try to reform the system and make things better. These two organizations are called Survivors United and Protect Our Defenders. Ryan informs me that every year they go to Washington, D.C., and they advocate for things related to military sexual assault, to issues, and try to create change. And he offers me the opportunity to go to D.C. with him and his team to be sort of the human side of this issue and to talk about the issues with victim notification when it comes to the military. So I said yes, because when somebody says, hey, do you want to go to DC? You say, yeah, I do want to do that. And it happened to be on a week when I was on vacation with my boyfriend's family. So I was on vacation. I flew to DC in the middle of my vacation and then went back to vacation. I'm going to explain what we were advocating. And this is all really legal and wordy. And so if you're still here, thank you for being here. And I hope that I am doing an okay job at making any sense of this, because trust me, this has been a lot for me to take in. Just to backtrack a little bit with all of this, I was told that there was nothing that could be done regarding my perpetrator's release, that there was no way to stop it. It was going to happen regardless of anything. And so he ended up being released from prison on May 2nd. And it was kind of crazy because the day that he was released was the day that I was traveling to my vacation. And, you know, I don't know exact details, but from the research that I've done, there was a strong chance that he was transported early in the morning from the state that he was being held in to the state that he was going to be released in via the airport. And the airport that he was going to be released to, that's if they went through the airport, like the civilian airport, was an airport that I almost flew through, and I ended up flying through a different location because the flights were cheaper. And I was flying really early in the morning. And so I had this weird feeling of, oh my gosh, I could have been at the same airport that he could have been at. And that would have been really weird and uncomfortable. And I have a lot of just general thoughts about the fact that he's released. It feels really odd. I don't think I really realized how much security I felt that he was in prison. And I only realize now that he's out. He does have to register as a sex offender. So I was able to see that and see his address. And I have like a little bit of solace knowing that he has that registration. He was listed as a level 1 from a risk standpoint though. So the lowest level that you can be listed at. I said it earlier, I was 100% sexually assaulted. And he is serving 75% of his sentence. And something about that feels wrong to me. I think that there is a reason that juries and judges give a sentence that they give. He was given 6 years because a jury sat and listened to all of this testimony and believed that he should spend 6 years behind bars, and he spent 4.5 years behind bars. What is the point of having a jury choose that timeline if he can earn days for good behavior? What is the point of having good behavior when that very behavior was a reason that it enabled him to assault so many people in the first place? There's a lot of parts of all of this that feel backwards. A part of me feels like I had been leaning into this idea that I still had time left while he was in prison, and then the rug was sort of ripped out from under me, and in a way of not being notified. And so much of being sexually assaulted is not being in control and having your voice taken away. And so not being notified, not having an opportunity to go before the clemency parole board, or even just give them a written statement, is yet another example of the system failing survivors, is another example of getting your voice taken away and being told without being told that your voice doesn't really matter. With that being said, I went to DC and I went with another one of the victims, and we were advocating for change. I'm going to read off of this thing because I have a whole really wonderful 2-page document that explains what we were advocating for, but it is still pretty complex. So I'm going to read a summarized version. There was 2 issues. Issue number 1, victims are not being notified about hearings or about prisoners being released. Article 6B of the UCMJ is a law that says that military victims have the right to be notified about things such as parole hearings or when a perpetrator is being released from prison. And so the problem is that even though the law exists, this system is very much broken because it's clear that victims are still not being notified. So even though we are supposed to be notified, we are not being notified properly. The system is outdated. It is a paper system. A human being is filling out a piece of paper that is being given to a prison, which is then by a human being being put and entered into a database. There are so many points of error. Also, not to mention that these forms that are given to the prison are filled out after trial, which is when in theory, it's filled out by trial counsel, but if it is filled out by a victim, there is so much, like you don't know what's going on. You're so disheveled after being in trial. And this is a closed system. So the victim, in order to get any of this information updated, they have to reach out to somebody and ask for it to be updated. You don't know who that person is that you reach out to. Victims do not have an opportunity to update that system because it is a closed system. You have to ask somebody else to update it for you, which puts all of that pressure on the victim to know who to contact, to remember who to reach out to understand who to reach out to update that information. And that's a lot to put on the victim. There is sort of this like accountability vacuum that happens because it seems that it is on the prison to notify victims. But if in this scenario, he is still under the guise of the Air Force, even though he is going to be discharged, why is it the prison's responsibility, not the Air Force's responsibility to notify people? I think that's sort of, it's a spot for these institutions to point fingers at one another and then therefore not claim any responsibility for errors. So it's unclear about who's supposed to be sending these notices, and therefore sometimes nobody does it, or they do it and they do it wrong. There are systems in place in the civilian world, something called VineLink, for example, which is an outward-facing system that allows victims it sort of puts the power back in victims' hands and gives people the opportunity to themselves log in and update their contact information and choose if they would prefer to be notified via email, text, phone call. That is a system that I'm sure still has a lot of errors, but at least it is something that is happening in the civilian world, whereas in the military space, there is nothing like that. It's an outdated system. It needs to be modernized. And I think it blows my mind that we are in 2026. We have electric cars. We have self-driving cars. We have AI. Like we literally have artificial intelligence, but yet victims aren't being notified properly about the status of the person who has sexually assaulted them in prison. That feels backwards to me. And so issue number 1, we were proposing that the military modernize their victim notification system to sort of mimic civilian systems, or to make just some sort of outward-facing system that would give power back to the survivor to be able to update their information and therefore, in turn, end up hopefully actually being notified. Issue number 2 that we were asking for was a bit of a heavier ask. And when I say heavier, I just mean one that might require legislation and things like that. And this is the early release gap. So currently, it is easier for a sexual offender to get out of military prison than it is for them to get out of federal civilian prison for good behavior. Generally, the civilian rules are that in federal courts, people convicted of sexual abuse are generally not eligible for parole or good time credits that can shorten their sentence. In this scenario, the military rules are that in the military, these same offenders can apply for parole after serving only 1/3 of their sentence, and they can also earn good conduct time to leave prison sooner. So you have a military person and a civilian person. And to me, especially in my scenario, people who are attending school at military academies or people who are serving in the military are put on a pedestal. We naturally assign a certain level of integrity and values to somebody who is serving our country. With my perpetrator, that's what we did. We had assigned all of this respect and integrity and this extra level of trust to this person that enabled him to be so close with my family and then assault several people. And to have laws in place that in civilian court, where you have just, average bears, right? You have average bears and then you have military people. Military people are kind of put on this pedestal, and then you have civilians. And in civilian federal courts, they're saying that people convicted of sexual abuse are generally not allowed or are not eligible for good time. They've removed that. But in the way that the military rules are set up, people who have committed the same sexual crimes are eligible for that early release for good behavior. To my knowledge and to my attorney's knowledge, there's not really a reason for this good conduct early release model. It's not like military prisons are overflowing with people, so they just need to get people out of there, from at least our understanding. And so the proposed fix is that the Department of Defense / Department of War, I don't really know anymore, that they change their rules so that military sexual offenders are categorically excluded from parole for good conduct time, so that it would match the stricter federal civilian standards. Essentially, get rid of the idea of good conduct for sexual offenders in the military because it doesn't exist in the civilian courts. And what that signal says is that had I gone through the civilian system with my perpetrator and he had been given this sentence, he would still be in prison. That sucks. It sucks that he's not still in prison. That's what I mean by it sucks. We did not meet directly with senators or members of the House of Representatives, but we did meet with people from their teams. So I have never done advocacy on the Hill. This was my very first experience with it. I've always imagined that at some point down the road, maybe I would do that. And then this experience landed in my lap and I was connected with the right people and this opportunity arose and I took it. And I'm not saying that advocacy on the Hill is my life calling, but it did feel powerful to know that for me and the other victims of this perpetrator, we don't get to go back in time. We don't get to be notified properly or have our voices heard. And our perpetrator is out of prison. He is now walking the streets. He is putting his life back together after prison. And we cannot change that. But we can potentially change the system to make it better for other victims so that they don't have to experience what we experienced, so that their voice isn't silenced because they weren't sent a proper notification. And I learned from my time in DC last week that this system is slow and it takes a long time for things to actually change. But I do believe that these systems can change. And sexual assault, sexual abuse of a child is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. It is an issue that I think everyone can agree upon, that sexual abuse of a child is bad. Sexual assault is bad. Rape is bad. We met with Republicans, we met with Democrats, and on one end of the spectrum, it was hard to know that these things aren't going to be just changed tomorrow and everything's going to be great. But on the other end of the spectrum, it was meaningful to know that these people were willing to meet with us and hear us out and ask for potential language to be put into the bill that they're passing. And I have been recording for, I'm pretty sure, 3 hours now. I'm so hungry. Yeah. So that is where I have been for the past 2 months or so. And I don't know what this next chapter holds for me. I do feel that all of this stuff related to victim notification and the early release gap is really important to me, and I'm going to pursue it as far as I can down the road in effort to create change. I think so much of being a sexual assault survivor is so shitty and hard, and it can be lonely and it's painful, and your voice is taken away at so many points, but this gave me a bit of hope. It gave me hope to believe that the future can be different, that things can change, and that it does require immense amounts of effort, and it's hard to know that that effort is put on the survivor 99.9% of the time. But I do believe that change can be created, and I want you to believe that too, that there is hope in these spaces, and that know that I had my attorney who was pro bono and a whole team of people behind him who I didn't pay $1 to, who had spent hours and hours dedicating their time to writing this 2-page document explaining all of these issues, to giving it to people to give to Congress members, to sending emails and setting up these meetings, to planning, to getting me to DC and getting me a place to stay. And there are people who care about this stuff. There are people who will move mountains for survivors and victims as victims and survivors deserve. They're not always outwardly there. We don't always see them, but they are there. And so let all of this be a story of hope. Let all of this be a signal that these systems are going to change. Whether it's tomorrow or 10 years from now, I don't know. But we are, in the words of Jess Michaels, in a reckoning right now. You don't have to be somebody who's, working on passing of bills to make change. You can create change by having a conversation with somebody about sexual assault, by listening to a survivor when they tell you that they've been harmed. Thank you so much for being here. If you guys have questions about any of this, because I don't know if this made any sense, please let me know. Send me an email to hello@whattheydon'tsay.com. You can also send a message through our website, which is just whattheydon'tsay.com. I hope you have a great rest of your week. I'll catch you on the flip side, and cheers.